All right, so I know we're supposed to be in Luke 10, but we'll get there in a little bit. We're going to start off in Matthew 13. So if you would like, you can turn over there for us.
Tell us who y'all are.
Why would we do that?
You're the anonymous teacher.
I don't want you to be able to track all the bad things I'm about to say. Yeah, way to go, Adam, not introducing us to the adult class.
Not at all.
Dereliction of duties.
Can y'all hear me with my mic?
I hear you. I bet you're right next to me.
You good?
So, my name is Terry Francis, and I preach in Chelsea. And there's a connection between Adam and Keith and I. We all spent a period of time in Memphis together. So, this is a little surreal for me. Keith is one of my sons, good friends. They grew up in high school together. And I guess when you were about a freshman or sophomore, you came over to church where we attended there.
Freshman year.
Yeah, and so it's kind of weird to take one of your kids and then teach with them, but it's also pretty awesome, if I do say so myself. Keith's brilliant. He goes to church here. Keith, I'll brag on him, works for Microsoft. He's one of those just brilliant minds, has been for a long time, but from a very early age, Keith and several of our guys, my son included, showed a really good talent and ability to speak. And the thing I love most about Keith is while he works secularly, he also is very active in ministry and wants to do so. He is just essentially, if you're at Edwards Lake, you're very blessed to have Keith because he's basically a self-supporting preacher that whether you call him that or not, that's what he is, and he's amazing. And so it's great to be with him. So that's who we are. This class is going to be different, okay, because we're not going to necessarily lecture, and if you've already figured out, we're going to be teaching at the same time. It's going to be more conversational. The way this works is Keith and I have prepared individually, separate from each other, apart from each other. We've discussed a few things in a few directions, and I put together a PowerPoint to kind of help us with that, but overall, this is kind of like two guys sitting down for a cup of coffee and talking about a passage, and you get to be a part of that experience. I've taught a couple times this way, and I prefer to teach this way whenever possible. So that doesn't mean we're not going to include you. You are going to be included in this kind of sit down and discuss, and we want your input. And if we get long-winded talking to each other and you really have something to say, just tell us to, be quiet and ask your question. Yeah.
What's Keith's last name?
Mattix, Mattix, if you're taking notes. Keith Mattix.
The cool thing about knowing Terry for a while is I expected him to just completely talk for me the entire time.
Yeah. Well, I get paid to talk for people. Yeah. So why does Jesus use parables? Somebody tell me why you think Jesus uses parables. Good way to tell a story, make a point. Understandable to teach a lesson.
We can see a depth in scripture. You can see a depth in a story. It makes you think about the emotions of the people.
Okay.
It separates those that want to know what does this actually mean from those that just hear an interesting take on
Yeah.
an agricultural.
Yeah, I criticized Adam because he basically messed up the order because the parable of soils in Matthew 13 is what we're studying the last day, but it's one of the early parables where Jesus says, this is why I teach in parables. Only Adam Shanks would put the why at the end of the week. So we're going to correct his fallacy and move the why to the beginning of the week. Not the parable, but just the explanation.
Kind of do a time travel.
Yeah.
We'll get the why, and then
Right.
That just means by the time we get to the parable of the soils on Friday, you should already be well prepared to
That's right.
have the discussion.
Or at least that section won't be as confusing. So turn to Matthew 13 and verses 10 through 17, because here's the disciples come in verse 10, and what the question they ask is the same question we just asked. Why do you speak in parables? So it's easy to answer this because Jesus answers it. Notice verse 11. To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. The one who has more will be given, he will have an abundance, but from the one who has not, Even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, you indeed will hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, their eyes have they closed, lest they should see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. This is a quote from Isaiah 6. Isaiah 6, where God says of Israel that they hear, but they don't understand, and they see, but they don't perceive. Now, the context of Isaiah 6, Keith, is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Because what is it that Isaiah is saying they can't understand and they can't see specifically in Isaiah 6?
Talking to me or them?
You. I'll let you start us down that path.
Sure. Well, it seems that he's talking about the prophecy that Isaiah's given, right? God's asking, who should I send to go and tell my people this message? And Isaiah says, the famous passage, "Here I am, send me." And then it's funny to me that God immediately says, what you're about to say they're not going to get.
Yeah.
What you're about to say they're not going to understand, but go and send them anyway, and talk to them anyway.
Yeah, and the specific prophecy really is, well, the best part, I think, is verse 13, that a tenth remaining, it will be burned again. Talking about Israel here will be burned or destroyed like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it is felled, and the holy seed is its stump. And so it's interesting to think of, and by the way, we'll point this out. I want you to remember this on Wednesday. It's interesting that the prophecy that Jesus references this section to explain the parable of the sower or soils references a seed. There's a connection they would have made. But the idea is that Israel is going to be destroyed and a stump's going to be left behind to produce the seed Jesus. Here's what's interesting, and this is why it's important, I think, for us to really understand what's going on here. How many of you easily understand Revelation? Huh? Read in your sleep? My favorite book to teach is Revelation.
And you taught me that book.
I did teach you that book. Here's what's really interesting. For these people, they would have understood Revelation more than the parables. And that's backwards to us, isn't it? Because we look at the parables and we think, wow, these are easily understood.
We'll teach them at VBS.
Yeah, we'll teach them at VBS for young children, and they'll all get all the points that are there. But you know what Jesus says about the parables? People will hear them and not understand them. And in comparison, by the way, what makes Revelation really difficult for us is it's apocalyptic literature. But for the 400 years of biblical silence, you know what really dominated non-inspired literature at that time? Apocalyptic literature. Because it was a time of distress and wanting to be delivered, and that's how the ancient people really encouraged themselves, is through that apocalyptic literature. And there's tons of those writings that are apocalyptic, that aren't in our canon. And so when you think about that, we are exactly opposite. We read the parables and we think, oh, these are easy. These are really simple. And then we read Revelation and we get, oh, like what? I have no idea what this means. By the way, if you're ever confused about Revelation means, it just means 3 words. God always wins. That's what it means. Okay? And you get bogged down in a lot of things, but anybody who reads Revelation and reads it like you would a story, at the end of the book you realize, be on God's side, he wins. That's the guy on the playground you want to play basketball with. He always wins, right? It's like the Capital One commercial where Charles Barkley's playing with 8-year-olds. You know which team's going to win. God always wins. Parables were harder than that. And what's interesting about parables is there is a depth to parables that we sometimes miss. There are multiple layers. And we're going to show that this morning, hopefully by going to Luke 10. But there's a simple layer to the parables, and then there's another layer, and there's another layer. And I think Keith, with our Western mind, if we don't, for instance, today, one of the things you and I both talked about, we want to connect this back to an Old Testament passage. Normally, we don't do that. And by not doing that, here's the key. the Jewish person would have connected this to the Old Testament passage. They would have understood the context of the Good Samaritan in the context of Leviticus 19 that we'll get to in a little bit.
You said something really interesting there. You mentioned context, and I think that's one of the things we often overlook when looking at the parables. Because they are self-contained stories, because they are very easy to teach to our children, when we read Scripture, we tend to stop short of really encountering the full context that they would have in that time. To your point about Isaiah 6, we might see, oh, this is indented weird in my Bible, but how much do we flip there and look at the context in which Isaiah 6 was written? Do we look at, we're in Luke today, but for the Matthew 13 passage, we look and see, why do we think Matthew is adding this here? Why is Jesus telling this parable to these group of people? And the Good Samaritan, actually, this is going to be, the context of who's Jesus speaking to, what else is happening around that passage of Luke 10. That's going to be really important when trying to interpret what's going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any questions before we go on about any of this? Hopefully we won't bore you to death. That's the hopeful good news. I do want you to know that we're essentially going to ask 3 questions for each class. And today we probably won't do this as much, but we'll try to break you up into groups a couple of times and have you kind of work on these a little bit. But I think today will be more kind of just understanding the process. But the 3 questions is, why does Jesus tell this parable? What is Jesus teaching with the parable? And how should the parable change me? Because I think one of the things that's really important is to take whatever we study and allow it to change who we are. And notice that question is not how would it change them, it's how would it change me. So it's an application for us from that standpoint. So the first is, why does Jesus tell this parable? Who knows why Jesus tells this parable?
To be clear, we're talking about Luke 10 at this point. Right?
Luke 10, yeah. Luke 10. Why does Jesus tell this parable in Luke 10?
At least the first reason is because he's answering somebody's question. He's trying to define a term, and really somebody's getting legalistic with them, basically asking, who do I have to be nice to?
Yeah. So it starts even before that question. There's a lawyer. By the way, when we think of lawyer, we probably think of that a little differently than this guy.
It's not Alexander Shannara.
Yeah, this isn't Call Me Jerusalem. But his job would have been to apply the law of Moses. Now, by the way, for him at this point in the days of Jesus, that included really 3 main things that he would apply, and really one more than the other, but the Torah, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. Lawyers of this day had helped basically break down the laws. There are 613 laws in the law of Moses that had to be kept. But then how do you draw the lines about how you keep those laws? And over time, the lawyers, with the help of the rabbis and the Pharisees, all together, they'd come together and they had figured out in their minds the specific requirements of how you fulfill these laws. And I was going to tell you, some of them are ridiculous. One of my more entertaining ones to look at is working on the Sabbath. And they would take a lot of different applications that could happen on the Sabbath and then define clearly what was work and what was not. One of those examples is, let's say that I'm taking something from my house to Keith and Alyssa's house. When I hand it to Keith, what would be work and what would not be work? Well, the Jews had decided that if I hand something to Keith through his door, that I have worked. But if I hold it and Keith reaches from inside his house and pulls it inside of his door from me, that is not work. Now we laugh at that.
It's better than my example.
Right? But how silly is that? And yet that's how legalistic they had drawn everything. what other passage of Scripture does Jesus deal with this that's not in parable form, but just straight teaching? Can you think of that? It's his most famous teaching of all time. That one, but really Sermon on the Mount. Especially Matthew 5. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery, which is one of the 10 commandments. But I say to you, if you lust after someone in your heart. You've heard it said, do not murder your brother, but I say to you, if you hate them. Well, what they had done is they had drawn these lines, and Jesus is saying, no, that's not how this works. In other words, they'd figure out how to keep the 613 commandments as strictly as possible. But they'd also figured out how to keep the 613 commandments without having to do one more thing. They didn't have to extend beyond. And that's a key, okay? We ever get that way? You think of any examples of how we define so clearly when we don't have to do something? Think of any of those kind of things? You have any?
Without getting into the parable, I mean, this is a kind of a silly example, but, I'm traveling out of town.
Yep.
I don't necessarily have to do my best to get to a worship service or make sure I take the Lord's Supper.
Especially now I can just live stream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to be there in person. I can just sit there and I'm getting God's word.
Yeah. Here's one I would think about, which is the area of benevolence. Sometimes we argue so much about whether somebody is either a brother or sister or not, and also whether they're actually in need or not, that it becomes our way to define a way to get out of any responsibility. I know of congregations before they would help a person at all, the person in need because of medical bills was a farmer, and rather than help them, they demanded he sell his livestock. Well, he could do that, but you know what that also does is that ruins his livelihood going forward. But that was the line they drew. And sometimes we get like that. By the way, the church had plenty of money. I know of a congregation that has 6 figures in the bank that makes you jump through hoops before they'll do any benevolence. And I'll just be honest with you, that's a lot like this story today.
You know, Terry, I think that it's important to point out that this is one of those situations that's not always so obvious to us.
Yep.
Because with the Jews, and I think with many churches, like the one he was talking about, I think it starts with a reverence of God's word. You know, a reverence of let's make sure we keep the laws that God told us to. Let's make sure we do what his word says. But like you said, sometimes you have to go that step beyond.
And we'll see that in the story today. It's pretty blunt when you get there. So the question, by the way, the lawyer comes why? What does the lawyer ask a question, the first question he asks?
What must I do to inherit eternal life?
Yeah, but why does he ask that question?
He's testing
Him. He wants to trap him, right? This is another trap of Jesus. Who else asked that same question? Do you remember? Of Jesus.
Rich man.
The rich man did in Luke 18. Sure did. Now, in Luke 18, the rich man says he's kept the law. And it's interesting, he mentions the laws. But here, he says, what is written in, Jesus asked him what's written in the law. And he rarely says the same thing Jesus says to Matthew 22 when a lawyer asks him to sum up the law.
It's not a wrong answer by any
No.
means.
In fact, the law of Moses can be divided 3 ways. It can be divided in 613 laws. It can be divided in 10 words, which is actually what the 10 Commandments is called, the 10 words Decalogue. Or it can be divided as 2 commands. All of those, by the way, are found in the law of Moses, in the Torah. In fact, what is here, what Jesus does in Matthew 22, what this lawyer does here, is he quotes Moses in both of these places. Now, just because it's not our focus, I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time on the Deuteronomy 6 reference. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, your strength, your mind. We're going to deal with your neighbor as yourself, which is from Leviticus 19 and verse 18. So he goes to Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19, and he quotes these 2 laws that sum up the entire law of Moses. And Jesus says, you're right. You do this and you'll live well. Okay? Well, no trap yet, so he has to keep going. And what does he ask?
Well, who's my neighbor?
Who's my neighbor? Why does he ask that? Okay. Why is he trying to justify? What do you mean by that?
He's trying to make himself look better. Like, I've done these things, and I can take care of these people.
Okay. Yep.
It's a very lawyery thing to do. Let's define our terms, and really define the terms like you described earlier narrowly enough.
Yeah.
You can start to get out of things, and that's really what he's asking. What do I have to do?
Yeah, what's my obligation?
It's like he's filing taxes, you know?
Yeah.
What, is this?
Everybody becomes a lawyer like that with the IRS time comes, right? Like, what do I have to report? Here's what's funny about your taxes. When it comes to what you have to report as your income, you want that very legal definition. When it comes to your expenses, you want a lot of liberty. Isn't that interesting how in the same form you go both ways? But yeah, he's looking for, well, what is my obligation? What do you think he thinks? Who do you think he thinks his neighbor is? How would he define his neighbor prior to the parable?
Up to 5 doors down.
Probably a little broader than that. Oh, is he acquainted with? More than likely from the text that he references, he would think anybody that's Jewish.
Go ahead and read Leviticus 19. I think,
Yeah.
I think it gives.
I'll let you read that, yeah.
Yeah, sure. And I think it really gives. What's interesting to me reading Leviticus 19 is that it basically, I think, defines the scope right there in the law.
Yeah, pick up with verse 9 probably through 18 is a good section.
Yeah.
Yep.
Leviticus 19, verse 9.
Yep.
When you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap to the very edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not strip your vineyard bare or gather its fallen grapes. Leave them for the poor and the resident alien. I am the Lord your God. Do not steal. Do not act deceptively or lie to one another. Do not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages due a hired worker must not remain with you until morning. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but you are to fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not act unjustly when deciding a case. Do not be partial to the poor or give preference to the rich. Judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not jeopardize your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not harbor hatred against your brother. Rebuke your neighbor directly, and you will not incur guilt because of him. Do not take revenge or bear a grudge against members of your community, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said to grudge the son. What did you say there before that?
Do not take revenge or bear a grudge against members of your community.
Yeah.
But love your neighbor as yourself.
You CSB?
CSB.
Yeah, listen to the ESV. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people.
I like the way the ESV renders that a little
Yeah.
bit better.
What does that mean? Jews. You know, in the law, he would have equated this verse, loving your neighbor as yourself. The first half of this verse says what? Don't take vengeance on the sons of your own people. Love your neighbor as yourself. So that's the context. And we're going to come back to that here in a moment. Any thoughts, questions about that before we move on? Anything stick out to you? Trying to pace ourselves. I mean, it's just an hour and a half class. So, by the way, when Adam told us you teach it for an hour and a half, I was like, what? It's like 3 sermons. You guys are getting like a month of lessons out of me in 3 days. I'm going to have to take the rest of the month off. It's crazy. Oddly enough, I don't preach Sunday, so I'm taking the rest of the month off. Okay, so I get distracted sometimes. Let's get to the what is Jesus teaching with the parable. Let's introduce the parable in Luke 10. And that starts in verse 29. I mean, we all know the parable, right? But let's go ahead and read it. So verse 30, because he asked the question, who is my neighbor? Verse 30, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him pass by on the other side, so likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. then set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend I will repay when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, you go and do likewise. Now, on the surface, what's the meaning of this parable? What's he teaching? Simplest, what are your kids going to learn today about this parable? What are they going to learn? What's the VBS lesson for kids out of this? Be kind to everyone, right? Everyone is your neighbor. Who's my neighbor? Everyone's your neighbor, right? Is there more to this parable, the way Jesus does this, than just that? There's a lot more. And I think one of the things that's really difficult for us is we don't catch a lot of the little small details that a Jew would catch here, and especially a lawyer. One of those is this idea of traveling to Jerusalem from Jericho. The Jews in that day would go out of their way, and Paul even did that, to travel away from the area where the Samaritans were. And it's similar today to, there's not, you said that the Samaritans, there's like less than 1,000 today.
Yeah.
But probably the better idea if you were to go to Jerusalem today would be you wouldn't travel through the West Bank if you're a Jew because of the Palestinians. And the reason why they would take this different route that was longer was because they were afraid of the Samaritans robbing them and harming them. Okay? What does Jesus do then with the way he constructs this story? He turns it upside down, doesn't he? Rather than making a Samaritan the villain, he makes the Samaritan the hero.
Yeah, if you were to write this narrative from a regular Jewish person's perspective, it would have been, the robber, the Samaritan robber, hurting this man, and then a priest or a Levite or someone doing this really kind thing.
Yeah.
But he flips the expectations, and so the lawyers kind of has no choice but to accept the result.
Right. And he's teaching a lot about their social construct. He's teaching a lot about how we judge others and view people. But he's also teaching a lot about the lawyer's approach. Earlier you said the lawyer was doing this so that he could justify himself. There's a reason why we read all that section in Leviticus 19, because if you go back to Leviticus 19, I want you to notice how many things that Jesus includes in the Samaritan that connect to Leviticus 19 in that context. So when you begin in verses 9 and 10 of Leviticus 19, that section is about what in Leviticus 19, 9 and 10? What are they told to do to take care of the stranger and the foreigner? You remember? Leave the edges of the field to glean. Purposely leave remnants of your harvest behind so that people who walk through your field could pluck the heads off the grain. In fact, you remember the disciples are pictured doing that on a Sabbath one day. And so what you could see there is that the law required you to leave your grapes and your olives, and so that a stranger or somebody in need, you could provide benevolent help that way.
We see that come to pass in the story of Ruth, right?
Right. In fact, in Ruth, what we see is that Boaz is seen as a hero in that story because he goes beyond leaving gleanings. He lets her come in as a harvester and to keep whatever she does for herself. Here's what's interesting is that the lawyer would have looked at it and said, okay, this requires me to leave grapes and olives for the stranger. but I don't have to give the stranger my oil or wine, because I've worked to process that and change that from grapes and olives to oil and wine. And oil and wine was always a higher commodity. What does the Samaritan use initially to take care of and clean up the beaten man? Oil and wine. You see how Jesus is taking, well, here's what the minimum requirement was in this passage that you're doing. But here's what the Samaritan did. What you're going to see is there's actually working through Leviticus 19 in this parable. And it's something that, by the way, are probably, unless maybe the older kids, Adam will get into this, but your kindergarten kids aren't going to hear this today, right? They're not going to make these connections. But they're really important to see. So, another one in verse 12, which seems odd, by the way. If you read this section, you get to verse 12. Every time I sit down, this cord tries to pull out my ear. When you get to verse 12, here's a thing in Leviticus 19 and verse 12 about the Lord's name, right? You shall not swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of your God. I am your Lord. Well, does that happen anywhere in the story? Is that anything that occurs in our story about the Samaritan? How many times do you think the Levite and the priest use their devotion to God as a proof of their character? Well, I'm a priest. You know you can trust me. You know I'm a good Levite. Right? What is it? Well, if they're doing that, they're really using God's name and their appointment by God to defend who they are. The lawyer would have claimed, by the way, that the Samaritan would have sworn by God's name falsely because he didn't worship God correctly. At the heart of this conflict, by the way, we didn't get into this, but is it Mount Gerizim? The Levite, the Samaritans worshipped, and remember John 4 with the woman at the well. Mm-hmm. Jesus gets into that about, well, she says, we worship on this mountain, they worship in Jerusalem, and that's where he says, well, there's coming a time where all that's going to change.
And the conflict between them goes all the way back to the Old Testament. And when you look at the Samaritan writings and the writings from the Jews, there's kind of conflicting accounts. Honestly, the best resource that we have for understanding where the Samaritans come from is Josephus.
Right.
And basically, from best we can tell, we see early references to the Samaritans in Ezra 4, when they're trying to rebuild the temple, and the people who are already there, when they come back from captivity, the people who are already there say, let us help you in this effort. And the Jews say, no, we don't want any part of you.
Right.
And then from then on, right, they start sabotaging and trying to prevent the building of the temple. And so they've been at enmity for literally generations.
And they build their own Gerizim. And in the 2nd century BC, the Jews go in and they destroy the temple in Mount Gerizim because it's not the right temple. And then when Jesus is a boy, the Samaritans come in and they desecrate the temple in Jerusalem. So we see that this conflict has gone back and forth and back and forth. Over and over again. So you have this priest and Levite who are part of the temple. They worship correctly. By the way, that was the Jewish, when you think about how the Jews tried to prove in the Old Testament that they were still God's people, it always went back to, we have your temple. We have your altar. We worship Jehovah. Even though, by the way, there's a couple of things in the Old Testament, by the way, it's kind of a side point. Anytime you see a couple of things happen, you know God's no longer with his people in the relationship that they need to be in the covenant. One of those is when the children of Israel neglect the poor and the innocent and helpless, which ties to this story. The other is whenever the items of the temple are used or taken, whether they're used to buy an allegiance with another country for protection or they're taken by invasion, without those consecrated items of the temple, you could not use the temple to worship. And so that was a very physical, literal reminder of this separation. You're no longer allowed to worship Jehovah. But when they're able to worship Jehovah, that's their thing. I mean, you think about Amos. Their whole thing is, we're worshiping God, we're worshiping God. I mean, I know we're taking money from the poor and we're like weighting scales and we're abusing the widows and the orphans, but we're worshiping come day of the Lord. And that's when Amos says, woe unto you, say come in the day of the Lord. It'd be like running from a lion into a bear. And he delivers the message, I hate your feast. Your sacrifices are a stench in my nostril. But their whole thing was, we worship, we're God's people. So the Levite and the priest, that would have been their thing too. Well, because we worship, I don't have to take care of the beaten man because I worship. Whereas the Samaritan realized, if I don't take care of the beaten man, my worship is useless. God won't accept it.
I'll even add on to that. If, it's a little bit of an if, but if the priest and the Levite believe the man to be dead, we're told he's half dead, but if from a distance they believed him to be dead, Leviticus 21 prevents priests from even from touching a dead man, even if they're relatives.
Handling the body, correct.
You couldn't handle the body. There's a special process you have to go through to make the body ceremonially clean.
One of the times you see that is when Eli's not allowed to handle his son's bodies, Hophni and Phinehas, and they have to be carried out because of that. Yep.
One of the points where I think it starts to ring really relevant to us is these guys, the priest and the Levite, they may have been thinking, I've got somewhere really important to be.
Yeah.
Like you said, I've got this position, I've got this purpose. My time is more valuable than this guy, and we have a tendency to kind of look at things that way.
Yeah.
And feel like, hey, I'm on a purpose, and I don't have time for this.
Yep. Absolutely.
You mentioned sometimes, making people jump through hoops or just taking the interpretation that matters most to us. Would it be more convenient for the priest and for the Levite to assume that the man was dead?
Right. And to use the ceremonial law as their justification for not doing anything. Absolutely. And I think that's probably what they did. More than likely, it makes the most logical sense. It could have been time. It could have been a lot of things. Could have just been they didn't want to deal with it. But the ceremonial law and the refusal to touch a dead body, I think, plays a big part. Another thing along that line about being half dead and so forth, in verses 11 and 13 of Leviticus 19, you're not to rob, beat, or oppress your neighbor. Well, the argument by the Levite and priest would be what? We didn't rob him. We didn't do it. But the Samaritan saw that if he passed by this man without helping him, that was the same thing as robbing him and oppressing him. Now, the Levite and the priest didn't violate the letter of the law. What we're starting to see here is that two of these guys walked right down the path described by the Jewish rabbis and kept the letter of the law. But the Samaritan took this to the next level. He surpassed those expectations.
Terry, I don't want to jump too far, but I can't help but think about one of the common applications now for us is homeless people.
Yeah.
I can't tell you, I remember growing up and, having people caution, you don't know what you're going to do with that money.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're just going off to drink or to buy drugs and you're aiding and abetting, right? And so what I realized, this is something I've gone through personally. When I see somebody, it was more convenient for me to assume
Right.
that they were going to use that money that I was going to give them for nefarious or illegal purposes.
Right.
And that prevents me from having any responsibility to help that person.
Correct.
And shame on me for that.
Yep.
That's the core, I think, of what Jesus is teaching here, what we're talking about. We're kind of dancing around.
Yeah.
There's responsibility. We can't use the letter of the law as an excuse to remove responsibility from ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's really what Jesus is getting at here. Leviticus 19:13, the Jews were instructed not to withhold wages from an employee. What was a day's wage? A denarii. What does the Samaritan do when he takes the beaten man to the inn? He leaves 2 denarii with the innkeeper and promises more if needed. The idea was you should give a man a denarii. The Samaritan, Jesus intentionally has give more. See how Jesus is taking this? Verse 14, I'm trying to speak through this a little bit more. Not to be a curse to a deaf man or a stumbling block to the blind. So protect the innocent and the helpless. Well, the lawyer would say, well, I didn't do anything to this man. But the Samaritan knew that passing by was being a stumbling block and cursing a deaf man. He was not protecting the innocent. Verses 15 and 16, not to be partial to the poor or the rich. And there's court language used here, which is interesting with the lawyer. So the lawyer would think to himself, well, I'm not obliged. I'm not going to be judged for not doing this, and I don't have to do anything. And yet the Samaritan walked by and said, how can I not do this? And finally, as you end here, is this idea of this hate and carrying the grudge, and it not being, it be the sons of your people. Do this for the sons of your people. The lawyer would limit it to Jews. Jesus specifically chooses a Samaritan to turn this on its head. Now, what is amazing to me about that, when you look at all those connections, is just how connected these two texts are by the way Jesus tells this parable. And they're connections that we don't always make, but here's why that's important. The Jewish lawyer would have made all these connections. He would have noticed all these things, the oil, the wine, the denarii, all of these things in the context the Jewish lawyer got. That's why parables have so much depth to them. That there is a level we can teach the kindergartners about be kind, but there's also a level here that says the very law you're quoting to defend yourself, you're breaking in the process. That's what Jesus is really getting at. That's the idea here. Any thoughts about that? Feel free to speak up. Questions? We bored them to death. Bored them to death. You still have 50 minutes. It's the bad news. Yeah.
My understanding, it's just speculation because that's what sometimes a lot of things are. The parables are something Jesus, it may have happened, and he may have made them up.
Correct.
And my guess is that he made them up because they fit the story.
Yeah.
And then there's, there are things that happen. But when it says leaving him half dead, I would assume that all three knew that he was half dead. And that's why the priest and the Levite went on the opposite side of the road. Usually somebody half dead, they're moaning and doing, breathing and doing something. If they would have carried the least bit, they could at least stood on the other side of the road and looked at the story.
Yeah, I think that the idea there often, though, is that they may have gone on the other side of the road before they were close enough to hear any of that. The other side of that is if they'd gone to help and he dies while they're helping, the ceremonial laws would still be broken. I cannot remember.
I think in Leviticus 21 it was touching.
Yeah, I think it's touching. I'll tell you this. If it was just touching, I'm sure that in the Mission and the Talmud, they'd figured out the distance.
Well,
Yeah.
think our brother's point is either way it's valid because the main point Jesus is getting across is they didn't care enough, even if it meant risking their ceremonial, rites.
Correct.
They did not care enough about that man. And to your point from a minute ago, that's what we're driving down the road and we see the guy on the side with the will work or whatever, and we're like averting eyes. I'm
Yep.
gonna look over here and pretend I don't see him. We're passing by on the other side.
Yeah.
We don't want to get involved.
Yeah, the other side of the road, there's a whole lot you could see about that. It's more convenient, it's easier, it's less costly, less sacrifice. And at the end of the day, that's largely what they're doing. I do think that Jesus is showing here that that's part of what they're doing. I'll also say that one of the things the Jews didn't understand is there are ox in the ditch moments. And that even existed in the law of Moses, where allowances were made that broke the law. David eating the showbread is one of those. That was a no-no. And he does it and he's not punished for it. Okay? There's some I can't explain better than that, because if you look at Samson's a Nazirite. The only time that vow gets broken is when his hair's cut, but he eats unclean honey from a corpse, which should have instantaneously taken his strength away, and it doesn't. God doesn't do that.
It's not until he breaks the last part of his
It's
vow.
the very last, and he essentially, Samson breaks every part of the Nazirite vow, and only cutting his hair is the thing that causes him to break the vow. And I don't know why that is. I do believe, though, those stories like that would prove to us that the Levite and priest, to your point, should know even if he dies and they touch them, God would make that exception just like he had for David, for Samson, and others.
I mean, it really shows a misunderstanding of God's nature.
And that's really what we have here. By the way, this is really not part of this. Let me get to this first. There's a lot of debate sometimes about whether it's a parable or a story. And that happens here, by the way, because sometimes it says Jesus is telling a parable, and sometimes Jesus says it's a parable, and sometimes Jesus just starts telling a story, and this is one of those cases. Is this a parable or a story? There's even a suggestion by some commentators, well, this has to be a story because if it was a parable, it could be fictitious, and the lawyer would have said, well, you just made that up, and therefore it doesn't count. The other one that big debate is the Rich Man and Lazarus. Everybody, that's the big debate and all that stuff. I would classify this as a parable just because of the depth and because of what he's saying here. Even if it's a real story, Jesus is using it as a parable in the same sense that he used the parable of the sowers and the lost son in Luke 15. So I think sometimes, by the way, sometimes us trying to define whether it's a parable or a story in some of these cases is the same thing as saying, who's my neighbor? We're trying to get this little nice box so we can, okay, this is all I need to learn from this, and I don't figure this out if we're not careful.
I'm realizing as we talk about it a little bit, I don't think we ever defined what a parable is.
We didn't really.
Not really.
Yeah. It's a story with a deep hidden meaning. I mean, I think we sometimes want to call it a fable, but I think it's much deeper than a fable.
The actual word, derived from the Greek, means to throw alongside.
Yeah.
It's this idea that you've got one meaning that you're trying to get across, and instead of going down that path, you're going down a parallel path next to it.
Yeah.
And the idea is that you can infer the main path based on that side-by-side comparison. So
right.
Just based on the meaning, there's not really any of those boxes.
Right.
Saying, oh, there's a name used here. That's a lot of us trying to, like Terry said, think in the boxes. And I think the idea, Jesus used parables to just try to get the meaning across. So if it happened, if it didn't, I think parable is more of a function,
yeah,
less of a categorization.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, and could be. I think one of the things that's interesting about this is it doesn't matter truly why they did. I think what Jesus is pointing out is they were wrong for that. And I think that's pretty big.
Our sister here was helping me want to make a comment.
Yeah.
From that passage in Leviticus 19,
yeah.
She was noticing at every point that you've been making, he says, I am the Lord.
Yes.
Or,
Yeah.
I am the Lord.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
the extension in where Jesus is applying this passage, the point is you should love your neighbor as yourself. You should love your neighbor and make everyone your neighbor because I'm the Lord.
Right.
That's,
well, really because of the first command, which we didn't talk about, but love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. Yep. And you think about Matthew 25, by the way, when Jesus divides the sheep from the goats, he says, you didn't do this. That wasn't, or we didn't. And so that's part of this too. Why did the Samaritan do what he did? Ultimately because, and this is really one of the points, it's not just who my neighbor is, but to go back to the first command, what you see here is the Samaritan served God better than the two men who were charged by their heritage and their assignment to serve God.
I'd even go so far as to say they understood God better. And
Yeah.
that's the cool thing I like with the point you brought up about Leviticus 19, that I am the Lord. If you look in your Bible, at least in mine, that's all caps.
Yeah, it's Adonai, or not, yeah, it's Yahweh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when with all caps, that typically means that's Yahweh, the name of the Lord.
Yep.
And so in a time in human history where there are all kinds of gods, each neighboring country, each area had their own god. That was the understanding, is that your God was bound to where you are. And so when the law is being given, these Israelites are learning about their God. And so what he's saying is he's giving these commands about serving foreigners, about not oppressing your neighbor. These are tied to Yahweh. These are tied to who Yahweh is at a fundamental level. And I think this is all connected. You say this over and over again. That's one of the points I think Jesus is making, is that, yes, you obeyed the letter. You got the first part of the actual command, but you missed why that command was given. Because I am the Lord, I am Yahweh, and this is something that's fundamental to who I am.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
I feel like that the priest would have known, the priest and Levite would have known this, because if they're justified, what good do they do in the story? If the lawyer knows, well, he's justified, he didn't have to. He's justified, he didn't have to. Jesus often asked a question that they answer themselves.
Yeah, I think you misunderstand my point. They're not justified. They're not justified because he is half dead. He's not dead.
I know they're not. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They don't know that, though.
Well, their excuse is, from my understanding, the way I would read this story is, if I go help him and he becomes dead, then I no longer can fulfill my duty to God. And me fulfilling my duty to God for the worship for the nation of Israel is more important than helping the stranger. And Jesus is saying, no. They're not justified, but like the lawyer, and this is why Jesus tells us this way, they think they are justified. That's the point of the story, is they have a justification for going to the other side. It's wrong, but they feel they're justified. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to pull together something too, just like the
Yeah.
together thing, and the fact that also the priest and the Levite, they touch things that were dead all the time because they offered sacrifice, which I think it's something, if you had just seen it die, just they would allow you to eat something. If they had seen it die, like it died, whatever.
Yeah.
Tree fell on it, whatever. But there again, I wonder about the priest. This is still off subject, but I wonder about the priest and the fact that they had to, when someone they thought they had leprosy, they were supposed to inspect it and all that. If they touched that, that made them unclean.
Yeah, they would have inspected it without touching it. They didn't, with the sacrifice, it wasn't dead when they sacrificed it.
Right, it wasn't.
Yeah. There were ceremonial ways to do these things without becoming unclean. It's also the purpose for all basins in the temple courtyard. So there's all these regulations and practices to remind them constantly, the changing of the clothes constantly, all of those things to remind them to stay clean, and the ceremonial laws. And, at the end of the day, though, I do believe had they helped and he died, God would be gracious. Just like I said earlier with David and the showbread and other instances. And they're not justified for walking by. The whole point of the story is that this lawyer is seeking justification, and what he does is he uses two Jews not helping a Jew, and the Samaritan, not only they would look down upon, but probably blame for beating the man up and robbing him, as the one who's helping to say there is no justification for your question.
Well, I think another way of formulating that is, even if they were justified according to the letter of the law,
Certainly not the spirit.
certainly not the spirit of the law, and that's what Jesus is trying to get across, that there is a higher standard than simply copy-pasting, like simply trying to blindly apply what the text says.
Which, by the way, has been Jesus' whole point in his teaching from Sermon on the Mount forward. There's more to this than the letter of the law. And I think that's why I think the Leviticus 19 comparison is so important, is this Samaritan goes beyond all of the letters of the law, the bare. It is if he asks you to go 1 mile, go 2. That's exactly what Jesus is doing with all of these cases. Don't just give grapes and olives, give wine and oil. Don't just give a denarii, give 2. Every one of these parallels in here is going beyond what is required of you and doing more. And the Levite, for whatever reason, like the lawyer, felt justified. He had done what he was required, whatever his justification was. Jesus is saying no, because he violated the greatest principle of the law, or the second greatest. The greatest was love the Lord God with all your heart and also your mind, but the second greatest, which is love your neighbor as yourself. And by doing so, he violates the law regardless of his self-justification.
Another way of thinking about it is, you tell your kids you can't eat in the living room,
Yeah,
and then they pull up a chair right
at the edge.
And eat an ice cream.
In fact, when we lived in Nashville, we had built a house, and it was a small house, one of the starter homes. The living room and the eat-in part of the kitchen, we didn't have a dining room. They were marked by a line of hardwood and carpet. Okay, and my son, who would be like 2 or 3 at the time, you would tell him you can't eat in the living room. He would literally sit on the edge and say, "Well, I'm not in the living room," right? And it's this drawing of lines constantly. Which is a huge part of this. We'll get on the application phase. Yeah.
Great application to the points you are making right now, where Jesus says on a few occasions, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Go
Yeah.
learn what
Yeah.
that means.
Amos. Yeah.
There
Yeah.
are things, what he describes as the weightier matters of the law.
Yep.
You're tithing these things, which you ought to do. I'm not telling you to ignore those things, but there are things that are more important. The spirit of the law, as you said.
Or James, where he says mercy triumphs over judgment. Yeah. 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 Great questions and comments, for sure. I wanted to share this. We were supposed to put that. I missed that slide. That was a great slide, too. I'll let you. That was a good slide. Okay. When you compare these two, between the lawyer and the Samaritan, the lawyer being in the darker colors, the lawyer's love for his neighbor is out of obligation, whereas the Samaritan's love is out of mercy and compassion. The lawyer serves or loves his neighbor because he wants a blessing in return for it. And the Samaritan loves his neighbor by sharing his blessings. The lawyer, by the way, is trying to preserve his goods, whether you realize it or not. He's trying to do as little as possible. And the Samaritan makes tremendous sacrifices. The lawyer offers his love as an event, something that's only going to happen when he has to at a point in time, where the Samaritan is seeing this love as a process or as a lifestyle. Let's see here, the opposite way. The lawyer refrains from harming. That's how he loves. He's not going to harm him anymore. And I think, maybe just think, well, if I help him out, I could actually do. That's our justification, by the way, with homeless people and unemployed people sometimes is, well, sometimes you got to teach them how to fish rather than just giving them fish. Right? That's what we say. But the Samaritan actively helps. The lawyer loves those who he deems as worthy, and the Samaritan just loves those who's in need. The lawyer loves his friends. Of course, Jesus said what about that? How are you any different than who? The tax collectors, if you love those who love you. The Samaritan loves his enemies because the Jew was his enemy. Make no doubt about that. And the lawyer draws lines, and the Samaritan goes beyond what is expected. It's this huge contrast between these two characters in the story.
One thing I think is an aspect of it too, it goes to the application y'all were making, is the fact that they could have, priest and Levite, been afraid of helping.
Yeah.
This could be a trap.
Sure.
I don't want to put myself at risk. Where the Samaritan is that true friend,
Yep.
willing to give himself for someone. So that it very likely could have been a dangerous situation that he was willing to walk into.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's, as I said earlier, I think at the end of the day, though, what the point is you're supposed to help regardless of the risk to yourself.
Can I go back a slide for me?
Sure, if I can figure out how to do that. There you go.
So I want to zoom in on the sacrifice part.
I can't zoom. I barely can change the slide. Anyway.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I want to focus, there you go. I want to focus on the sacrifice aspect of that because you mentioned a denarius is a day's wage and a denarii is 2 days' wages. I think sometimes we skip over that.
Yeah.
Because when you think about helping a homeless person make that application, I mean, maybe we'll give, crumpled up $20 bill, something like that. This man gave 2 days' worth of wages. I mean, that's a pretty sizable chunk. You think about that in your own budget, what that looks like for someone he didn't even know. Not a friend,
Stranger.
A stranger.
Yep.
Someone who
And promise more. Yeah.
exactly.
Actually.
Like, I mean, that sounds like a blank check to me. Whatever is needed for this to happen, I will pay that.
Yep.
And from somebody who looked down upon him and his people, who thought they were dogs. In fact, Jesus calls the Samaritan woman a dog at the well.
Yeah.
And he goes to great personal sacrifice for this. Meanwhile, the lawyer on the other end is trying to say, okay, well, who technically is my neighbor? Do I have to do this for? And then I bet the follow-up question, if you couldn't get Jesus with that, how much do I have to give at that point? So
Yeah, but Jesus traps him. Jesus traps him so much he doesn't have any other questions. I think that's what's interesting here, for sure. Before we go on, I did want to make this point earlier when we were talking about parables. I think one of the things is there's a lot of depth to parables, but sometimes I think we can go too far in parables. Sometimes we have a tendency to try to make everything into an allegory for Christ and the church. And there's a way that can happen here where the victim's the lost sinner, helplessly on the road of life. Priests and the Levites are the law, which can't save the sinner. And the Samaritans, Jesus comes and takes. That's not what Jesus is doing here. And the reason I say that is because it's not the context. The context is, and I think this is one of the things we miss too, is we miss this with the Sermon on the Mount, we miss this here. Jesus is actually teaching them how to keep the law of Moses in this parable, not the gospel. Now, there's not a distinction, truthfully, but his basis for this is the law of Moses, and it is teaching the Jews how they were supposed to live under the law of Moses. This is what was expected in the law. That's what he's doing in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. That's what he's doing here. And I think sometimes we struggle with that. But for those Jews, that's the law they're going to be judged under in this moment, which is why Jesus is keeping it there. So I did want to kind of point that out, don't go too far. I mean, we do that with Scripture a lot, by the way. It's like, I'll just be honest, this might ruffle some feathers. Song of Solomon, we want to make into this allegory about Christ and the church. Song of Solomon is just a beautiful book, poetry that's inspired to show under the law of Moses in that time, the law and the prophets, what marital love should look like. And by the way, if that makes us uncomfortable, it shouldn't. That's what God wants us to feel like. And we shouldn't be embarrassed by that to turn it into an allegory, and we shouldn't force allegories where they just not there. The context is not what that's about. So I just caution us to do that in that sense.
Context,
Yeah.
if we wanted to apply that to our lives, can we say that it's about personal responsibility for each of us?
I'm glad you asked that, because the next phase is, how should the parable change me?
perfect timing.
Perfect segue. We didn't have to do that ourselves. So,
Personal responsibility.
Yeah.
We can't look at the Samaritan and think it's someone else. It needs to be us taking care. If it's not the church taking care of people, collectively, it's our individual responsibility to give and to go out of our way and to give our money and our time, everything else that we can give of and love our neighbors, because my neighbors might not be your neighbors.
right?
Your neighbors, but I mean, so that's personal responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's a great application, the personal responsibility. Listen, I think one of the things to understand about the way God designed, and we see this in places like 1 Timothy 5, is God doesn't intend for the church to be burdened when the individual can and should handle that burden. And, I don't know if you realize this, but as individuals, we sure like to outsource our work, right? Just across the board.
I'll study with this person. I'll
yeah.
call the preacher.
I'll call the preacher. He'll take care of that. I don't have to be an active spiritual leader to my kids. I'll take them to Sunday school. I don't have to help teach my kids even a secular education. I'll let the public school do all that. Which, by the way, that's not an endorsement of homeschooling. My kids I went to public school. My wife's a public school teacher, but parenting still demands you be involved in that. And so we like to just we'd rather write a check, let somebody else handle something for us. That's really what we'd like to do. I'd rather give my money to the church and let them take care of benevolence than me have to do that. And yeah, it's a tax write-off that way. You're right. Yeah, I can claim that on my taxes.
You bring that up. That brings to me comparisons to the rich young ruler.
Yeah.
I wonder. This is a bit of speculation for me, but I wonder if he didn't expect him to write a check for this.
Yeah.
Or do this, not sell all my possessions.
I mean, he did say write a check. He just said write it for everything.
Giant check.
Yeah, the biggest you could write. So yeah, personal responsibility is here for sure. What else is here besides personal responsibility? Any?
This to me would get back to your point about how we convince ourselves not to help people because they may misuse it. And I do think there's some wisdom required there. For example, the guy on the street corner, how much are you really helping him? You just throw a 20 and drive off, or even 100 and drive off. You haven't really helped him.
Yeah.
To help him would require more than that. Maybe say, hey, will you let me take you to McDonald's and I'll buy you a meal, and while you're there, preach the gospel.
Yeah.
What the Samaritan does in the story is not just go drop some water on his mouth and then go on. He actually moves the guy from a place of desperation and puts him in a place where he can get better.
Safety, security, healing, restoration. It reminds me of Acts 3 and 4, the healing of a lame man, the first miracle recorded in Acts, where Peter and John are going to the temple, and Peter says to the lame man, I don't have silver and gold, but what I have I give to you, and he heals him. Well, he gave him a greater gift than financially. So there is a part of this where we need to see those as opportunities. I mean, as a personal preference, when somebody comes and asks me for something, I try to give them what they're asking for instead of the money to do that. If they're hungry, I try to feed them. If they need gas, I will go to the gas station. And I will tell you that in parts of the country where I've preached, sometimes that means we go to the gas station, I put $2 in their tank. And they still try to get more money. And in those cases, I don't give them more money because they've proven themselves to be unworthy in that sense. But now I can't use that to tell the next guy I'm not going to give him anything. And I think that's one of the things here that's the issue. We're not saying that you shouldn't use some wisdom. And oh, by the way, I think one of the things to keep in mind is it is literally impossible for you to love your neighbor the way that the Samaritan does. I mean, the earth has, 7 billion people? You can't, in a sense, Jesus is saying everybody's your neighbor, but there's no way for you to go love 7 billion people today. There's no way for you to do that in your lifetime the way the Samaritan does. That's taking the story too far. But it is saying, unlike you who seek to justify yourself, you need to step up and be responsible. And part of that is this lesson that I think extends beyond that, which is you've got to be careful about all these lines you want to draw. I think one of the things, I'll just be blunt and push the envelope a little bit here. I'm from probably like most of us in the room, from a very conservative heritage. And one of the things that I learned early on was how to draw certain lines so I didn't have to do things. We were really good at that. And I'm not sure that's what God wants. And sometimes the practices we make are a whole lot like what I said earlier with the Sabbath day about whether you can do something reaching through the door or reaching out. And we try to figure out all these little caveats and exceptions. And I think sometimes in doing that, we miss opportunities to do good. Recently, this is something that won't be too controversial. I hope there's a guy we support in Honduras whose truck went out of commission and had to have the transmission fixed. And essentially what ended up happening was the elders, deacons, and us, we all donated and covered that. But I made the point, and we did that. The elders asked us to do that to feel more connected to the work. There was a reason for that. But as I pointed out to them, first off, we have money in the treasury. That's something that could be justified to support that man by just writing a check out of the treasury. But sometimes, in this case, it wasn't the case. Sometimes we argue about where's the line of what we can do. When I think sometimes the line is just keeping us, not in every case, but keeping us from doing anything.
To that point, and I think this is one of the things, how the church changes. There's a lot of ways to illustrate it, but we have a tendency to ask, what do I have to do?
Right.
This man does.
Obligation.
Instead of what can I do?
Yep.
And then when you start framing things that way, what can I do? What do I know God? So, for instance, do we have to take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week?
Yeah.
So do we have to? If you're
Right.
asking wrong, ask, can I? Do I get to? Will God be happy with me?
Yeah.
It opens up a whole new mindset for you when you see things like that.
Part of my stuff today came from this book by Edwin Crozier, who's one of my best friends, Samaritan. I don't even know if it's available anymore, but there's a lot of good stuff in here. But he tells a story in that book about an elder in Beaumont, Texas, where he was at, he said he went to the, and you'd have to know Wesley. There's a lot of stories, Wesley stories I've heard over the years. But he went to the hospital to ask Wesley, check on Wesley. He'd had surgery. He's going to be out of commission in a few days. And he's like, hey, man, is there anything I can do for you? And how many of us have said that? Like, we say that all the time. Let me know if I can help, right? What do we really mean by that? Don't let me know. Because Wesley looked at him and said, yeah, I need somebody to mow my yard this afternoon. And my friend made this face. And the elder said, my son's doing it. I just wanted to see how you'd react. And it was one of those moments. Like, we say things a lot of times hoping I don't have to do it. What's the least I can get by with? Okay, I really don't want to go mow the guy's yard, but I'll make this kind of, hey, do you need anything? Hoping you'll say no. Because the reality is we don't want them to say yes when we say those things. We just don't.
That's a funny illustration. It's also a really good one because it gets to something that I've seen a lot, where as a whole we're actually typically pretty good with opening up our checkbooks and we're good with the money side of things.
Yeah.
But time, that's
Yeah.
usually a little bit of
Give me a GoFundMe over an actual time activity any day. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. We need to do a better job budgeting our finances and our time to help those who are in need. Period. Individually, I mean, here's I'll pick on the collective, the church, just for a moment. I've worked with, at this point, 4 different churches. I only know of one that actually budgeted benevolence. And the excuse always was, well, we'll handle that if it needs it. But when that approach was taken, I'm just going to be honest, a lot of times what that led to was a who is my neighbor kind of conversation. Do we really have to do this? Rather than being prepared to know there's just going to be people. And I think that's just a different mindset in our minds, that we know this is something we got to be prepared for. We're not going to go all the way to 11, but we've got a few minutes. We got to talk about the elephant in the room that we've not talked about yet. And that's, you got a white guy and a black guy talking about the Samaritan.
Didn't sign up for this, did you?
Yeah. Yeah. He is. I'm the arrogant Jew. One of the things that brought us together, and when I moved to Memphis, this is almost 15 years ago, when the elders said it was a white church. I mean, there was probably 15% black, I think, at that time, not very many. And if you know Memphis, inside the city limits of Memphis is 80% black. Outside the city limits in the county of Shelby County is 20% black. And that's slowly changing. But one of the things said to me early on was, if you're going to grow in Memphis, you're going to have to grow in the black population. Are you okay with that? And I said, I'm okay with that. I'm not sure you guys are ready for that yet. And There's an element of this story that is attacking the racism of Jerusalem. I'm just going to say this as bluntly as I can. Sometimes we like to pretend that we've fixed our race problems in our country, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Still a lot of work that needs to be done. One example of that is our churches are just too segregated. They're just too segregated. And by the way, I think Keith would agree to this. That's because of both sides.
I worshiped at both white churches and black churches.
Yeah. And there's a fear of, if, I think Keith's family felt this a little bit, you come to a predominantly white church, you may lose your culture, your heritage a little bit. And that's justified because we expect black people to act more white when they come to church. I don't know if you remember this. I think you were there. You know, I'll tell you, by the time I moved away from Memphis, we were probably a fourth to a third black. It was pretty integrated. And there were a lot of amens, okay? But there was 4 families that came from the downtown church, Trigg Avenue, that was all black church. And when they came, the women started amening, and the men, and those were issues we had to deal with. And I had a sweet sister of mine who was in her 70s, millennial, come up to me and say, and she, by the way, before I tell you this, because it may sound offensive, she and I have a special relationship. I could call her today, and she will pick on me and tell me I've not changed and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of like a mother and a son. She came up to me one day after they'd been there about 3 weeks and said, "Do all those amens bother you?" And I said, "No, I'm kind of hoping they rub off on some of you old white people." And she just laughed, and she's like, "They probably should." It was funny because at one time the women decided they needed to say amen, but they didn't think they could, so they held up blank white pieces of paper.
I was not there.
Yeah, that was before you. And we had different things like that. And I will tell you, one of the hardest things when you are at a church where the amen like that is when you go preach somewhere else and it feels like a dead, lifeless group. You miss that. There's challenges to integrating the culture for all of us. But at the end of the day, here's the key to that. We're going to go to heaven together.
You better get used to it.
We better get used to being together here. And race and prejudice is not just about skin color. Another one of those issues, we actually had a woman who came to our VBS and ended up becoming a member for quite some time, who was not only black but had been Muslim for several years, had a Muslim name. That throws up a bunch of red flags and alarms, and how do you handle all of that, and what do you do with all that? I'm not going to sit here and try to pretend like that integration was perfect and it didn't have kind of bumps. I will tell you, these guys did a lot better job than people that were our age. The high school kids did not have the issues we had. There wasn't a weekend probably, there wasn't a month where at least 2 weekends our boys weren't spending the night at somebody's house and, just crazy stuff. And to this day, they're all close friends, and it's a beautiful thing. But part of this story is intended to get us past our blinders when it comes to racism. It was for them. It is for us, 100%. And we just have to realize that that doesn't mean, by the way, that I don't want you to see color. If you've ever had a real conversation with somebody like Keith, that is offensive because they want you to see blackness, and that should not make us uncomfortable. I just think we need to do a better job of that. Keith and I have a special relationship. We've had lots of deep conversations about race, and
It's been how long? 8?
yeah, a long time.
And
Yeah.
because we feel, at the end of the day, I know I'm going to heaven with Terry,
Yeah.
and that relationship makes me able and desire to understand him more.
Right.
It makes him want to understand me more.
Yeah.
And it makes for some honestly really, really good conversations.
In the area of race, especially in the South, I think we are a lot like the lawyers sometimes, where we want to clearly define and we want to look for lines and we want to put boxes around things, and we want to, well, that's not fair, and this and that, and the letter of the law. This is intended to challenge us to look past that. There is a part in this that is deeply racially motivated by Jesus. This is a half-breed person you can't stand, and he's the hero of the story. Final thing, and then we'll break because it's almost 10 till. Do you notice how Jesus ends the story? What's the question he asked at the end? The question was, who's my neighbor? Right? You would think that the neighbor then in the story, the way it is the beaten man. It's not. Jesus says, neighbor. Kind of puts it back on the lawyer. Who acted like a neighbor? It's not about who is my neighbor, who acted like a neighbor. Well, it's the one who showed him mercy. Who's my neighbor? Everyone. Go and show mercy. Go show mercy. Today you're going to have somebody in your life you need to show mercy to. Maybe it's us in this class. I don't know, but yeah.
Especially from a perspective of people who, like y'all were describing, with Christ, we're all one. We're all
Yeah.
one in Christ. And so when you look out there and you see a bunch of people who you could neighbor, you can be a neighbor to them.
Right.
And if you do that, you might be able to bring them to Christ and literally make them your brother.
Yeah.
So when we can learn to look out in the world and see a bunch of potential brothers out there, that's awesome.
It is. By the way, I will say that evangelism is messy. That's a thing I tell people a lot. I've bailed people out of jail because they were somebody that I taught the truth to. It's a weird thing to go through, right? Evangelism is messy, and it costs. But that's here. It's messy to clean up a beaten man. It's messy it's sacrificial to give 2 denarii. But that's what it is to love your neighbor. Ultimately, the greatest thing you can give your neighbor is not finances or time. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's probably why he ends with the parable of the soils on Wednesday out of order. So, but don't tell him it makes sense. So we don't want him to know that.
I am convinced that it does make sense.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for your attention. We enjoyed it, and look forward to tomorrow. Parable of the Lost Son is a great story. I think I have like 12 sermons off of that, so we have to try to push that into an hour and a half. No, we won't.
Stop us.
Yeah, we won't. Yeah, we won't do all that, but it's a great story. So thank you. We could give you time to move back to your seats so you're not with the children.